Hello, gamers! The Commander bracket system recently received a new update, and while there hasn't been a ton of time to gauge the newest changes, the initial iteration of the bracket system, at least, has been met with a generally positive response. It seems like overall, it's given a lot more structure to Rule Zero discussions, which is great. It's a fairly simple system so far, and it's a nice addition to the ban list, especially for a format with as many cards as Commander. Arguably, the most complicated part about the bracket system is the Game Changers list, which is similar but different to an outright ban list. Each bracket gives you varying access to cards on this list, which means that you do have to keep in mind how many you're running in any given deck. With the newest update, the list is starting to grow, currently housing 61 cards, which when combined with the ban list is upwards of 100 cards. Not too much considering how many cards there are in the format total, but not an insignificant amount of cards to have to remember either. The question today is, do all of those cards that are on the Game Changer list deserve to be there? So, I've decided to go over it, give some detailed thoughts about the individual cards on it. Both articles the Commander format panel put out so far mention the individual cards in brief, if you want to read it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but I'll be covering things both using my own experience and analyzing them from a Commander meta power level perspective. So, let's get into it. We'll be going over things by color, just to keep it in order, since that's how the list was separated here to begin with. Our first color is white, and starting off we have Drannith Magistrate. This is a pretty understandable inclusion, since not only is this a stacks piece that shuts down the ability to cast commanders in the first place, it also disrupts a variety of mechanics such as impulse, flashback, or casting from your deck, and it's a pretty common staple in competitive play. There's a lot you could say about it, but any way you look at it, it's very powerful in Commander, and most people find the stacks aspect pretty unfun. Enlightened Tutor is next, and while this one is a more inoffensive card on the surface, it sees even more competitive play than Drannith Magistrate does. The sheer consistency and value of such low-cost tutors like this is hard to overstate, especially for such an otherwise fairly inconsistent format. And we'll see a good few other cheap tutors as we go here. Next is Humility, which is finally one of the cards on the list that sees virtually zero competitive play. Humility is a new addition to the list and was absolutely only added because of how annoying it is. Almost nobody runs this card, but when it does come out, it's a fairly all-consuming stacks piece until it gets removed, given most strategies in Commander tend to be creature-focused. I can understand having this card here from a gameplay experience perspective, but I would personally consider it fairly weak on average still. That being said, not all colors can deal with enchantments easily, and very creature-focused decks might find themselves completely hosed by this card coming into play, so I don't think it's too out of place for the list. Serra's Sanctum is another card that barely sees any competitive play, and this one's for more good reason. Enchantress decks can be strong, but ultimately they're pretty off-meta in the current competitive landscape, and white is arguably the second weakest color for competitive play. While it is true that you can draw comparisons between Serra's Sanctum and Gaia's Cradle, the actuality is that enchantments are generally weaker than creatures on average, and thus they see a lot less play across almost every archetype in the format, but especially a lot less play in competitive. Enchantress decks are the exception that can make use of Serra's Sanctum quite well, but even then, it's rarely going to reach the levels of mana that Gaia's Cradle can, considering how difficult it is for most decks to get out a high volume of enchantments compared to a high volume of creatures. I honestly don't think that Serra's Sanctum really needs to be on here, since it's not really a staple, it only works with certain build-arounds as well. On top of that, there are already cards like Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx, that slot into nearly all monocolor decks much more naturally than Serra's Sanctum does. So yeah. Moving on though, the next card we get is Smothering Tithe, which is a much more understandable card for this list. This essentially feels like a treasure-producing version of Rhystic Study, and as a result it's one of the strongest mana engines in the entire format. On top of that, the soft tax feature on opponent draws can make for a much more annoying value engine than many other more generic cards provide, so it was a practical shoo-in for the list. Lastly, we have Teferi's Protection, which is similar to Serra's Sanctum in that it sees very little competitive play, but it does rhyme with other cards that do see lots of competitive play, most notably Angel's Grace. There are a lot of reasons that Angel's Grace is much stronger than Teferi's Protection in CEDH, though. First is the mana cost, of course, but second is that lose the game, win the game, and damage loop effects are significantly more common win conditions in competitive, and Angel's Grace prevents all three, while Teferi's only works against the damage. Third, Angel's Grace has split second, and therefore it's almost entirely uncounterable, making it very difficult to respond to. And lastly, Teferi's Protection exiles itself after use, which Angel's Grace does not. It's much easier to recur an Angel's Grace, and since it's cheaper, you can even slap it on an Isochron Scepter if you're so inclined. Teferi's Protection, on the other hand, shines in that it can protect your board alongside yourself, and it both fully prevents your life total from changing and protects you from being targeted by spells. It also has the upside of protecting you from commander damage, which is a much more common casual win condition. Excluding lose the game and win the game effects, Teferi's is a bit more general purpose than Angel's Grace is, even if the effect is more expensive, situationally weaker, and one-time use. With all that being said, I honestly think it's a relatively fair card for casual play too. It's strong, sure, and it can respond to a lot of situations, but so can a counterspell. It can't be reused, and in casual, holding up 3 mana for an instant to save yourself instead of developing your board can be a notable setback for many decks, so it doesn't have much use beyond win and loss protection. And honestly, there are a lot of other white cards that can protect your board with upside. It's a fairly ubiquitous card in casual, but I don't think it's as powerful as many of the other staples here, nor as annoying as many of the other cards on the list. Our second color here is blue, and it's the biggest category, which makes a lot of sense coming from the most powerful color in the format. Naturally, that means there should be a lot of very powerful cards here, so let's start things off with the newly added Consecrated Sphinx. This card is strong without a doubt, being one of the best top-end plays in competitive and a very powerful draw engine all around. While it's not as efficient as a lot of the other cards we'll be seeing here, it's a great target to cheat out via reanimation or reduction, and even if it isn't Blue's scariest top-end threat, it's still a strong contender. Very reasonable inclusion for the list. Next up is Cyclonic Rift, and if you've ever played into this card, you probably don't need me to explain how powerful it is as a board wipe. What Cyclonic Rift lacks in cost efficiency compared to other strong board wipes like Toxic Deluge, it more than makes up for with a couple different advantages. Firstly, it's an instant, allowing you to use it on an opponent's turn right before untapping, functionally making it cost nothing for the turn that you're actually pulling off a win on. Secondly, it has the benefit of flexibility, being usable as a single target bounce in the most dire situations. And lastly, it is entirely one-sided, hitting your opponents but not your own board, making for a very deadly finisher that allows you to push through and win with your board. The different use cases and utility for this card are hard to overstate, and to me, it pretty easily earns a spot on this list, even if it isn't necessarily the strongest blue card here. Next up is Expropriate, and while this card doesn't see very much competitive play, it might be one of the more notorious finishers in casual. Expropriate is the kind of card that I often see described as scaling with the skill of the table, which means if every player in your pod is thinking about optimizing their chances of winning, they'll almost always vote for money, since a 9-mana sorcery that takes 1 permanent from each opponent and then takes an extra turn is a little underwhelming. For that kind of mana, there are much easier spells to cast that will win you the game, but in casual Commander, the base human instinct of loss aversion tends to take precedence for some players, so they'll happily give the caster additional extra turns if it means keeping their board untouched, especially if their commander is out. The amount of decks that function much worse without their commanders makes it fairly likely that you'll be able to get multiple extra turns out of an Expropriate, and I don't think I've ever seen a player take more than 2 extra turns in a row without winning the game, so I can see why Expropriate is here. That being said though, even if it sees a very small amount of CEDH play, I'd still call it one of the weakest cards on the list, And it's a bit of an interesting inclusion when you consider the no chaining extra turns rule for all brackets that actually use Game Changers. I think most people would consider Expropriate a 1-card extra turn chainer, so the fact that it's on the list despite already arguably being covered by that rule is a little bit odd to me. The next 2 cards I'll just lump together, since they are extremely similar, those 2 being Fierce Guardianship and Force of Will. It's hard to say exactly which one is stronger, but at the core of it, they're both free counter spells, which are extremely useful in a variety of situations, protecting your win or removing massive enemy threats on the stack, all while not needing to use any mana makes for a very powerful design. While it's likely that you won't see these kind of cards quite as much outside of competitive, and while it's true that Force of Will puts you down a card, a free counterspell can still be a very unexpected and powerful blowout in a casual game. These cards are definitely best left in CEDH and highly optimized decks, in my opinion, and they're almost certainly the strongest cards we've covered so far, definitely deserving of a place on the list. Next up is Gifts Ungiven, which was unbanned with the newest update, and it's immediately most comparable to Intuition, which is another card that was just newly added to the list as well. Gifts is a bit more flexible due to searching for one more card, as well as allowing you to fail to find cards, thus putting a guaranteed pair of cards into your graveyard if you absolutely need them to be there instead of your hand. However, Intuition being a mana less makes them both pretty similar in use case and effectiveness. They're ultimately both fantastic graveyard tutors that also replace themselves in hand, with Gifts potentially getting you 2 cards to hand for the increased cost. As of writing, there's no competitive data for any of the new unbans that I've gotten, but Intuition sees a lot of CEDH play, and I'll be surprised if Gifts Ungiven doesn't end up seeing just as much play, if not more. So these 2 are pretty firmly in the camp of highly efficient tutors, giving up a bit of mana efficiency for more card advantage and an instant speed cast time. Very strong and sensible cards for the list. Next up is Jin-Gitaxias, Core Augur, and this card is one of the weakest that we've seen so far from a CEDH perspective. Jin is our first actual commander on the list, though I almost guarantee you'll never see him in the command zone. Most of the decks that run this card will be trying to cheat him out in some way, since the 10 mana cost is absurdly expensive for a card that does fairly little right away. But even then, cheating him out feels kind of anticlimactic compared to many other top-end threats, even just in blue. I can understand that the hand size reduction effect can be annoying, but even with the relatively light stacks effect, I don't think having Core Augur on this list is especially justifiable. I'd even argue that his Progress Tyrant iteration is just as good and just as annoying as the original, if not more so. It might be a bit unpopular, given that hand size tax can be fairly annoying again, but I think this guy can be taken off the list, honestly. Moving on though, Mystic Tutor is the blue counterpart to Enlightened Tutor, this time getting either an instant or sorcery. Much of the same logic applies here as before. It's a very commonly played competitive staple, thus a fairly powerful card. Once again, pretty sensible inclusion for the list. Narset, Parter of Veils, is next, and she's a pretty strong stacks piece, especially with her loyalty ability granting you some selective card advantage on top of the passive. The real draw, of course, is the card denial, since it turns wheels into hand removal for others and card advantage for yourself. It hoses a good deal of cards for a fairly small investment, and even if Planeswalkers are less likely to survive in casual games, she's still quite the annoying stacks piece to deal with, especially used in conjunction with wheels. She may not see a ton of competitive play nowadays, but she still gets run a good deal, so she's a very understandable inclusion nonetheless. And finally, getting to the strongest blue card, and arguably the strongest card on the list, we have Rhystic Study. Most of what I said about Smothering Tithe earlier applies to Rhystic Study as well, except this card is both cheaper and gets you a much more powerful resource, that being cards instead of mana. This card is arguably the most efficient card draw engine in the entire format, requiring no effort, no setup, simply enough mana to cast it and pass. Mystic Remora is arguably the only card to give it competition, and by comparison the fish is a lot weaker outside of competitive metas. Rhystic is very powerful, very annoying, and very deserving of a place on this list. Next we have another recent unban, that being Sway of the Stars. Unlike Gifts Ungiven, however, this card is actually pretty bad. I can't see any competitive decks wanting to run this, as 10 mana alone is borderline unplayable, especially on a non-permanent spell, making it significantly harder to cheat out. But going to all of that effort for a soft game reset, a wheel, and some burn? Honestly, this card doesn't even need to be on the list here, since by the new definition of mass land denial, Sway of the Stars is always going to be taking out enough of your opponent's lands for it to count towards that, so it would already be limited to bracket 4. Not only does this card suck from a power level perspective, it's a bit of a nonsense card to have on the Game Changer list, and in my opinion it's kind of just wasting space here. I imagine it's only here temporarily, since it was just unbanned, but hopefully they take it off soon enough. Thassa's Oracle is our next blue spell, and if you've never seen it played before, you might think it seems a bit innocuous. Devotion and Scrying aren't particularly powerful, but the main strength of Thoracle, of course, comes from the combo potential. Anything that mills your whole deck lets you win with Thassa's Oracle, and since it's tied to an ETB trigger, you can layer the combo pieces with an instant for added protection. At only 2 mana, it's by far the most efficient win condition in the entire format, and combos incredibly easily with many cards. And yes, naturally it sees plenty of competitive play. While I'm a bit more ambivalent about combos on the Game Changer list, especially when there are already rules for combos in the lower brackets, I can still understand putting Thassa's Oracle here to help open up more space for less powerful win conditions, since even a 3-card Thoracle combo is probably still too fast for bracket 3 without some degree of restriction. Lastly, we have our first actually usable commander, that being Urza, Lord High Artificer. Urza is arguably the most powerful commander in Mono Blue, and sees a decent amount of competitive play. He's a good value engine for mana production, and has a mana sink built in for infinite mana outlets. In competitive, he helms a polymorph deck, making use of his ETB to get a little robot out that he eventually turns into a horrifying kraken. Not only that, but Urza has his fair share of self-combos too, making the mana outlet even more relevant since most of it is infinite mana production. While it can feel like he's a bit propped up by other cards and strategies, he does have relatively fast 3-card combos, which might be a bit much for bracket 3. Though despite all that, I'm ultimately a little bit more neutral on him, since while he is a strong card and can be a powerful combo piece, I think there are quite a few other cards that fit that description better which managed to dodge the list here, but ultimately he's still a pretty fine inclusion. And that is all for our blue cards. So, let's move on to black cards now, starting off with Ad Nauseam, a classic CEDH staple, and possibly the most efficient burst draw spell in the entire game. Many decks live and die by trying to cast Ad Nauseam at instant speed and winning the game the following turn with the 30 or so cards they just drew. The life loss equal to mana value element adds a pretty fun angle to the design, but for the format where you have 40 life, it lets you dig deep enough that even the format inconsistency rarely ever stops you from winning the game on the spot after casting it. Very powerful card, and a very understandable inclusion for this list. Bolas' Citadel is next, and while the effect reads similarly to Ad Nauseam, this card occupies a space closer to Consecrated Sphinx, in my opinion. It's essentially another top-end value engine, though Citadel is a bit more polarizing, since it doesn't give you quite as much direct card advantage, but it does cost reduce. It functions a bit more immediately than Sphinx does, and notably it can combo with a couple other cards to go infinite. Despite not really being as much of a staple as Sphinx or some of the other cards on this list, Citadel does see a solid amount of CEDH play. The main issue with comparing it to Ad Nauseam is that it's significantly less efficient since you brick on lands, and you're paying more mana at sorcery speed for a generally worse effect. However, considering the combo potential, it makes sense for it to be on the list despite the power gap. Braid's Cabal Minion is another freshly unbanned card, and she can be a commander at that. I remember seeing some talk of her being scary when I first started playing the format a decent few years back, but in the current year we essentially already have a better version of her with Braid's Arisen Nightmare, and that card only sees a very small amount of CEDH play, so I would be incredibly surprised if old Braids ends up being a problem. The one argument I can see is that some people might find her annoying, especially since she can kill lands, but I think Arisen Nightmare is arguably just as annoying and more powerful, so I don't think there's too much reason that Braids should be staying on the Game Changer list in the long term. I'll honestly be surprised if she doesn't get unlisted eventually. Next up we have Demonic Tutor, which is arguably the most efficient tutor in the game. 1 for 1, any card directly to hand, extremely powerful, sees almost unilateral CEDH play, and thus it's another very easy inclusion for the list here. I've somewhat been brushing over tutors, which might confuse some people who see them as a means to an end, rather than a power outlier themselves, but I'll be going more into depth on my thoughts there later. I definitely agree with the CFP including them here though, and I'm pretty in agreement about Imperial Seal as well, being another extremely efficient tutor, even if it's not quite as good as Demonic or Vampiric, respectively. Either way, I feel it earns the place here quite comfortably. Next card we have is Necropotence, another powerful draw engine that lets you pay life for cards. This card is somewhere between Bolas' Citadel and Ad Nauseam for me, being not quite as much of an instant win as Ad Naus, but being a much stronger draw engine than Citadel. Either way, it's still a competitive staple. It's another one of those cards that partly abuses the 40 life total that the format offers. It's very easy to see why it's on here. Opposition Agent is another card that fits the list almost perfectly, hitting pretty much every negative trait you could think of. It's a very powerful competitive staple. It's an incredibly annoying stacks piece that can come down at instant speed, and it can combo with cards like Wishclaw Talisman or Marilyn for one-sided tutors and theft. Definitely one of the most deserving cards on this list. Next is Orcish Bowmasters, another competitive powerhouse that sees even more play than Opposition Agent, and it's somewhat similar in that it's a great flash-in response to enemy draw power, but instead of being direct stacks, it's a ping effect accompanied by token generation. This card isn't quite as stacksy as some of the others here, but it is incredibly powerful, working like a cheaper, more control-oriented version of Sheoldred the Apocalypse for half the cost at instant speed. Plus it gets the effect on ETB, so you don't even need to wait for an opponent to draw for this to have an impact. You can just kill a Birds or a Ragavan or an Esper Sentinel right away. Completely shuts your opponent off from using wheels or mass draw, turns your own wheels into one-sided board wipes and tons of damage, not to mention a myriad of token creation triggers. Very cheap and powerful competitive staple with a lot of different effects. Definitely another deserving card for the list. Next we have Tergrid, who is another potential commander, and more often than not people do run her in the command zone as opposed to the 99 of a deck, given her effect is somewhat of a build-around. She allows you to steal the cards that you edict or duress away from your opponents, functionally making it so that you don't necessarily need to run a win condition of your own, you just need to run enough discard and sacrifice removal to steal your opponent's win conditions. She also functions as a partial stacks piece, making it impossible to perform sacrifice loops or sacrifice non-token permanents for value, and similarly shutting down discard-oriented decks. This general play pattern has proven to be one of the most hated among commanders, even if she's not an especially powerful card on her own, seeing virtually zero competitive play. Even so, it's understandable for her to be here given the somewhat universal hate she gets, despite how competitively weak she is. So she's another card that I think is ultimately fine for the list. Lastly, for black, we have Vampiric Tutor, which I believe I mentioned earlier, and you probably get the point already. It's a hyper-efficient tutor, lets you get anything, arguably best in class, etc. Very strong card. That's it for black cards, though. So now we can get to red cards, which is our smallest category here. If you're a CDH player and you haven't been paying attention to brackets, it might surprise you to hear that one of the strongest colors in the format only has 4 cards on the Game Changer list, but thankfully for me, it makes things easier to get through quickly. And what is red if not the fastest color in the game after all? So, first we have another new addition with Deflecting Swat, which is our first redirect on the list. And if you haven't played with a redirect before, I won't be the first to tell you that these effects can be extremely good. They're not quite as broad as counterspells are, but they make up for that with the sheer advantage that they give, allowing you to functionally stop an enemy's spell or ability and use that effect for yourself, so long as the effect targets something, of course. Deflecting Swat here works on both spells and abilities, and furthermore, it's free if you have your commander out, so the flexibility and power that it has easily put it up there with the best counterspells in the format in terms of strength. It may see barely less play than Fierce Guardianship does, but it's still a very powerful competitive staple that easily belongs here. Gamble is another new addition and another incredibly efficient tutor, getting you any cards straight to hand for one, albeit at the price of discarding a random card. The RNG element barely holds it back though, being one of the most played and most powerful cards in the entire format still. Another cheap CEDH staple tutor, very unsurprising to see it here. Next is Jeska's Will, which is a pretty classic staple both in competitive play and casual play. I wouldn't call it quite as good as Deflecting Swat given the baseline cost, but the upper bounds are pretty powerful, since the ritual side of the card scales to whichever opponent has the most cards in hand, which can be game-winning amounts of mana in the right circumstances. The impulse for 3 that you get along with the effect usually makes this spell a baseline draw 3 that pays for itself and then some, and while it funnily enough sees the least competitive play out of any of the red cards here, it's again still easily a staple and an exceptionally powerful card. Very much makes sense for the list. Lastly, we have Underworld Breach, which is one of the most powerful combo enablers in the game, recently being banned out from Modern and still seeing tremendous amounts of play in competitive Commander. If Thassa's Oracle were banned tomorrow, Breach would probably be the most efficient combo line in the whole format. Even if somehow every efficient combo piece was banned out from under it though, the baseline value that this card provides for sacrifice and graveyard decks is probably still just as good as other CEDH staples like Yawgmoth's Will. So Breach very much belongs on the list. And that entirely covers red cards, and this is by far the most objective category so far it feels. If we're looking at it purely from a power level perspective, every single card here is a blatant competitive powerhouse that holds more than enough precedent to stay a game changer. The only thing that I might disagree with for red is how few cards they have on here, especially considering every other color on this list has multiple game changers geared specifically towards casual play. I'm surprised we didn't get something like Blood Moon, for instance, given it's a pretty famous stacks piece that still even sees a little bit of CEDH play to this day, though it's also arguably already covered by the new mass land denial terminology change. And even if red is one of the stronger competitive colors, it's arguably the weakest for casual Commander, so banning more casual cards like they've done with other colors here might not be as much of a concern for red, though that logic should also apply to white if that's the case, so that's probably not the real reason as to why red got largely ignored here, but as for what the real reason is, only those on the Commander format panel know for sure. So anyway, next up is green, and this color has the highest amount of newly added cards, so let's get into them and see how these additions hold up. Our first card is Crop Rotation, which is one of the new additions, and it's a pretty reasonable inclusion, I'd say. It's definitely the weakest tutor we've seen so far, just being a land tutor, but the instant speed value is noteworthy, and we do keep getting more powerful land prints with time, so there are a lot of good options and combos and powerful utility among lands, especially in the competitive landscape. All things considered, it follows the efficient tutor mentality they've gone with so far for game changers, and it's still a CEDH staple. Food Chain is the next new addition here, and while it's not quite a staple in competitive, it is still one of the more notorious combo lines, especially notable for being one of green's few ways to win in CEDH, though even then, it's best when used alongside other colors, as is usually the case for green. That being said, food chain combos are almost always early game 2-card infinites, so it's a bit surprising that it needs to be limited with a game changer slot in spite of that. There might be a couple of food chain combos that are low to the ground 3-card combos, so maybe that's what they're trying to avoid, but I can think of a lot of other cheap 3-card combos that actually see CEDH use, so I'm not quite as sure with this one. It's a good card, but it feels a bit unnecessary to list it for a game changer by that token, though maybe it's there to keep the Prosh players in check, perhaps. Either way, it is another one that feels like it's already covered by the brackets rule, and thus feels like it's a bit of a waste of space, similar to Expropriate or Sway of the Stars. What isn't a waste of space, though, is Gaia's Cradle. This is still one of the strongest lands in the format, being a pretty common CEDH staple and one of the easiest inclusions in most casual green decks for people looking to scale up their power. Despite the strength, the main thing holding back Cradle from being one of the most played lands in the format is both the color identity and the build-around requirements. Despite the build-around being a very low barrier for casual decks, which almost always tend to run sizable boards of creatures, CEDH doesn't have quite as much luxury with wide boards, especially with board wipes coming down more frequently in the early stages of the game. Thus, Cradle does have the value floor of being a land that does literally nothing, which can sometimes backfire in competitive. The second issue is that it's a green card, so naturally most high-tier Grixis or otherwise non-green decks simply aren't able to run it. None of this matters much for casual though, and it arguably performs even better at casual tables with less land destruction and wider boards. Plus, it's still a CEDH staple even with all of those earlier caveats. If this card were in a better color identity, like blue, and scaled with a better card type, like artifacts for instance, well, that would probably just be outright overpowered. Crazy theoreticals aside though, our next card is another new addition, that being Natural Order. And this one is quite interesting to me, since it's our first tutor that is neither cheap nor a competitive staple. In fact, it sees almost no competitive play, likely again owing partly to the lack of strength that green has in the current meta. The stated reasoning for this being on the list is that it's a strong way to cheat out big creatures easily, but I honestly can't see it hitting very many problematic cards in the first place. They brought up Crater Hoof, but cheating out Crater Hoof early kind of sucks actually, since you won't have the board to be able to win with it, and Natural Order kills one of your creatures, making your board even smaller, so that seems like a non-issue specifically. Even trying to find the strongest competitive cards to use this with, the best I can really see is hitting a Nyxbloom Ancient, since cheating the cost on that gives you access to a lot of mana all of a sudden, but that feels like more of a reason to have Nyxbloom Ancient on the list than it does to have Natural Order, especially considering Nyxbloom is a combo piece. The value of tutors is the flexibility, and for the strongest tutors, it's the low investment cost. While you can generally refund some or all of the cost with Natural Order, you're still ultimately just reducing the cost of whatever big green creature you're getting, and you still need to pay the baseline of 4 mana plus sacrificing a green creature. In terms of competitive viability, the color limitation and costs put it far behind other meta-green tutors, and for decks that have fodder to sacrifice, Chord of Calling lets you tap them to pay for the spell anyways, and doesn't limit the kind of creatures you need to tap to tutor for, making it generally much better at cheating costs, all while being instant speed, and hitting the genuinely concerning top-end threats that exist outside of green. The article they put out covers other green tutors and specifically says that they wanted to hit Natural Order because of its ability to tutor anything, quote-unquote. So I almost have to wonder if this card was a genuine mistake or not. I just find it very hard to see why this card would make it here over other meta tutors, and why they would claim that it tutors anything when it's one of the most limited creature tutors in scope. Then again, they also said in early game Crater Hoof is threatening somehow, despite Crater Hoof explicitly being a card that scales with your late game board development, so maybe the article was a bit rushed to begin with. All this being said, I do think Natural Order is a good card with high potential. I just think that in practice the potential is much more limited, especially when compared to something like Chord of Calling, which can get you a Hullbreaker Horror for entirely free on someone else's turn, for instance. Natural Order is not really a card that follows convention, nor is it a card that I think really belongs on the Game Changer list. Though, there is another pretty powerful green creature that Natural Order can hit that I didn't mention, and that's because it also just got added to the Game Changers list, that being Seedborn Muse. Much like Nyxbloom Ancient, this card gives you a tremendous mana advantage, especially if you manage to cheat it out early, though unlike Nyxbloom, it's both cheaper to cast, refunds the mana you put into it right away, making it a much more immediately impactful value piece. While it can't combo for infinite mana like Nyxbloom, the amount of mana advantage you get is still tremendous, especially if you have an instant speed mana outlet. But even if you don't, it still gives you the power to spend all your mana developing your board before refreshing it all for interaction. It gets extra value out of non-mana tap abilities as well, and overall it's probably one of the best green creatures in the entire format, given how the ability is basically 3 times as effective in a 4-player game. It's not exactly an auto-include in most CEDH decks, but it's still at a high enough play rate that I would call it a staple, so it makes a lot of sense here. Next up is yet another new inclusion to the list, and a new tutor at that, at least sort of. Survival of the Fittest is essentially a tutor engine combined with a discard outlet, allowing you to feed creatures from your deck or your hand into your graveyard, all while holding the most efficient creatures to actually play in your hand. Even with a mana cost per activation, Survival of the Fittest is one of the strongest discard outlets in the format, and even if it's not quite a CEDH staple, it still sees a good deal of competitive play, especially in graveyard strategies. It's the kind of card that requires a bit more of a specific archetype or build-around to work in a deck, but it puts in a lot of work for the decks that it does find itself in, so it's another fairly reasonable inclusion for this list. Next up is Vorinclex Voice of Hunger, and this is another example of a card that is basically just an annoying stacks piece which sees no competitive play at all. Voice of Hunger is a legendary creature, and as a result it's probably the easiest stacks piece on the entire Game Changer list to deal with if it's in the command zone, since you'll see it coming from a mile away and simply need to find and hold removal for it. The absurd casting cost makes it hard to hold up protection for outside of the late game, and by the time it comes down, it's probably beyond the point of slowing the game down enough for it to be a particularly big threat. It's difficult to make use of the extra mana you get from it without waiting even longer to play it, which further weakens the stack side of the card, so the design is a bit intrinsically incongruous. Despite all of the factors that make Vorinclex a relative non-threat at most levels of gameplay, it is by far one of the saltiest cards listed on EDH Rec, so there must be a tremendous amount of people who have played into this card at lower brackets, and being able to potentially cheat it out early can, make it more threatening, of course. To that end, it's pretty similar to Humility, though again, arguably much easier to deal with than Humility. And while I understand the card being here for the general annoying perception it has, it's another card that feels like it falls into the Sway of Stars category, wherein it should already be excluded from any brackets below 4 anyhow by virtue of fitting the new definition for mass land denial. So to me, it's another card that feels like it's wasting a slot, given there's already rules against it for the brackets where Game Changers actually matter, so it kind of just feels symbolic more than anything, which is probably a bad way to go about a list of cards that people need to either actively reference or memorize to be able to partake in a system. It's another one that's a bit confusing to me ultimately, and I definitely don't think it needs to be taking up space on the list, given it's mechanically excluded from anything below bracket 4 already, in my opinion. Moving on though, we finally get the last new green card added to the Game Changers list, that being Worldly Tutor. This one is really easy to cover, thankfully, since it falls perfectly into the cheap tutor category that we've seen so many times throughout this list, falling right alongside cards like Vampiric, or Mystical, or Enlightened Tutor. It's another CEDH staple, it's very efficient, it's arguably the best competitive tutor in green, it's a very easy inclusion. And now that we're done with monocolor cards, let's get to the multicolor spells, starting with freshly added Aura Shards. This card is essentially a removal engine, which was a bit of a strange inclusion to me at first, but we do technically have another pair of removal engines already on the list. The first being Orcish Bowmasters, a significantly more powerful and flexible card that is cheaper, can come down at instant speed, provides advantage and burn on top of the pings, and scales significantly better with 3 opponents at the table. And the second is Braids, the archaic removal engine commander that is only here as a result of being recently unbanned. I can't really see her staying on the list for much longer, like I mentioned, though maybe she'll serve a bit more time due to her ability to hit lands. Compared to those 2 removal engines, though, Aura Shards is again a bit of a confusing inclusion to me, neither being a flexible, cheap, competitive powerhouse like Bowmasters, or a recently unbanned potential land destruction engine in Command Zone like Braids is. Shards sees almost no competitive play. It's a bit more of a build-around card, needing a fairly wide board to achieve more incremental value over time. It's fairly slow in comparison to most removal, and the majority of optimized decks would almost certainly much rather just run spot removal or sweepers for artifacts and enchantments. That being said, it is interestingly rather high on the EDHREC Salt Score page, though even then it's below other persistent removal engines or removal pieces like Dictate of Erebos, Toxrill, and Elish Norn, Grand Cenobite, the latter seeing notably more competitive play as well. And in the vein of more competitive removal engines, it's much weaker than other cards that aren't even on the list, such as Hullbreaker Horror or Tidesprout Tyrant. None of this to say that Aura Shards is a bad card, mind you, but it is certainly one of the weakest cards on the Game Changers list, and in comparison to other cards both on and off the list that share design space, it is pretty easily overshadowed. I guess I can somewhat understand that removal engines can be annoying, since I'm not the biggest fan of control decks myself, but Aura Shards in particular doesn't really seem like a proper fit for the current list in my eyes. Moving on though, we have another freshly unbanned card with Coalition Victory. So obviously it's here because any unbanned cards get automatically listed as a game changer, regardless of how actually good or disruptive the cards are. I have almost no doubt in my mind that this is going to see virtually zero competitive play. I don't think it's remotely in the ballpark of CEDH speed, and it's incredibly easy to interact with. However, it is arguably one of the more spontaneous ways to win a game, requiring a bit less setup or less time than most other cards with the win the game text, many of which need you to wait till your upkeep, for instance. However, this does fall pretty flat when you compare it to a variety of other win the game cards that are executable on the same turn they come down. 20-Toed Toad has more strict requirements, but is half the mana to win immediately with just a haste enabler and a lot of draw power, and that's all doable in just mono blue. Similarly, if you merely play Ramses and kill one other player with an assassin, you win the game. Arguably a less strict requirement, and Ramses is also half the cost. Halo Fountain is about the same cost, has a bit more setup necessary, but it also has other utility that it can use to set itself up on prior turns, so it isn't just a dead card, which also goes for the other cards mentioned so far. Biovisionary and Approach of the Second Sun both need a lot more mana, but the only other setup they need is having one other card in hand to combo with them. And then you've got the obvious Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, and Laboratory Maniac, which are almost as easy to win with as Thassa's Oracle, which is itself a game changer. All that to say, I think Coalition Victory is probably one of the weaker alternate win conditions in the format, even considering the somewhat bursty nature of it. There are a lot of other cards that can win much faster in the same turn they're played, so I wouldn't be surprised to see it come off the list before too long. Moving on though, we have Grand Arbiter Augustin IV. This is pretty plain and simple. He's an Azorius tax piece that can be played in Command Zone, and honestly it's a pretty strong one too, given it reduces the cost of your own spells. Even outside of Command Zone, it can be a pretty solid slot in a variety of decks, giving a pretty significant mana advantage. Ultimately, it's not a ridiculously powerful card, but it does still see a bit of fringe competitive play, so it's certainly strong enough to be notable, especially when you've got a relatively annoying effect stapled onto it, and it's runnable in Command Zone. Again, not one of the best cards on the list by a long shot, but it does make a lot of sense to see given the game changer mentality so far. After that, we get Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy, and oh boy, this is probably one of the most deserving actual commanders on the list here by a long shot. Kinnan is both the enabler and the payoff, and is one of the strongest legendary creatures in the entire format by a mile, being in and of itself a competitive staple and being easily one of the strongest current CEDH commanders. Being able to generate such a massive mana advantage and then turn that advantage into either combos or terrifying threats using the activated ability, the speed and consistency with which a Kinnan deck can lock down the game is pretty difficult to match. Definitely earns a place on the list here. Notion Thief is another new addition as well as the next card on our list here, and it's kinda like a weaker opposition agent. Instead of flashing it in to steal your opponent's tutors, this one flashes in to steal draw power, which can still be quite powerful, and quite annoying to play into. Unsurprisingly, you can also combo this effect with Wheels to completely void your opponent's hands and draw a quarter of your deck, which is a pretty powerful combination. It's not quite a competitive staple, but it does see a solid amount of play there as well, so that combined with the very stacksy nature of this card makes it another pretty fine inclusion for this list. The next card we get is Yuriko, the Tiger's Shadow, and she's in a bit of an interesting spot to me. Despite Yuriko being generally seen as a competitive commander, within the current CEDH landscape, she hasn't actually been seeing a lot of success lately. She's not a bad card by any means, but it does seem like she's fallen off a little bit in power. Though, since the Game Changers list is obviously more geared towards casual play, I think there are a couple primary reasons why Yuriko is here despite her currently lackluster competitive performance. The first is that her power floor is incredibly high compared to most commanders, wherein even a bog standard Ninja Kindred deck scales to be very scary with Yuriko's second ability. The second reason, of course, is the unique commander ninjutsu mechanic, allowing Yuriko to be a persistent threat no matter how many times she gets removed, since she can use it to dodge command attacks. In longer games, this type of inevitability easily makes her one of the most threatening commanders at any given table, especially when every random ninja thrown down further scales her power. So even though she's not quite at her competitive peak anymore, she's still quite the sensible inclusion as a game changer. Lastly, we have Winota, Joiner of Forces. Winota is in a slightly similar position to Yuriko, where she's pretty well known for being a CEDH commander, but also hasn't seen a tremendous amount of success lately. But with that being said, Winota has always been a little bit more fringe than Yuriko, at least until more recently. Unlike Yuriko, though, Winota doesn't have a command tax cheating ability, and while her attack trigger scales pretty well with an evenly balanced deck, it's still not necessarily as directly fast or threatening as Yuriko. The primary reason for Winota being on here is probably her notoriety for being a stacks commander. Despite not having a stacks effect tied directly to her, almost every competitive deck you'll find with Winota at the helm is stuffed full of hate bears, slowing the game down tremendously for everyone else while scaling out an increasingly wider board to beat everyone to death with. This playstyle is fairly deeply entrenched with Winota, so even though there are other ways she can be built, almost every Winota deck is going to end up with some degree of stacks in it, especially the ones using EDH to build. I think she's another pretty reasonable inclusion in any case. And lastly, we have our final and second largest category here, which is colorless cards. And since these cards can go into any deck, there's probably going to be a lot to talk about here. Ancient Tomb is thankfully a pretty easy starting point, since it's quite comparable to the recently banned Mana Crypt, as well as the universal staple Sol Ring. In my experience, most people are pretty strongly in favor of Sol Ring being a game changer, and it's pretty easy to agree with the land version of such an effect being on the list here. Tomb is another CEDH staple that sees almost unilateral play across the format, and given it's a fast mana piece, it would be really hard to justify not listing it as a game changer in my opinion. Similarly, we have Chrome Mox next, another universal CEDH staple and fast mana piece. I'm also going to lump in Mox Diamond here, even though it's further down the list, since These cards function extremely similarly, with Chrome Mox needing a colored spell to exile and Mox Diamond needing a land to discard. Generally speaking, CEDH decks tend to slightly prefer Chrome Mox, mostly due to wanting to play out the few lands that they run in the early game as opposed to discarding them, but the difference in play rate is small enough that it's negligible. Both cards do technically have a card disadvantage cost, which can make them less efficient in poorly constructed casual decks, for instance, but that still doesn't really do much to take away from the raw strength of having free colored mana accelerators. Thus, they're very easy inclusions for this list. Moving on, we have our first new colorless game changer with Field of the Dead. This one is one of the more interesting lands we've seen so far, since the reason to run it isn't for the mana advantage, but instead for the utility effect of token generation. And Fields of the Dead is by far the most efficient token generator on a land, especially in landfall decks. It's so efficient at what it does, in fact, that it even sees a small amount of competitive play. That being said, I think this is probably the first creature token generator we're seeing on the list, other than arguably Bowmasters, so it's quite a standout card in that respect. It doesn't quite hit the same volume or power as cards like Scute Swarm or Springheart Nantuko can, but given it fits into the land base of the deck, the opportunity cost for inclusion is incredibly low. Even if hitting token generators feels a little bit weird for a list like this, with how generic and strong Field of the Dead is, it still feels like a fairly reasonable inclusion to me. Next up is another utility land actually, that being Glacial Chasm. Glacial Chasm leans even harder into the utility aspect than Field does, producing no mana and even making you sacrifice a land on entry, and then further paying a cumulative upkeep of 2 life. It also entirely turns off your own creatures from attacking, but all of that downside totals out to a final effect which prevents all damage dealt to you. So ultimately, this is a protection spell in the land slot, and it's essentially a way to freeze out the game while you dig for whatever non-combat win condition your deck is built around. The costs for this card definitely require some building around, but the payoff is pretty difficult to surmount for a lot of casual decks especially, given how many of them are built around combat win conditions. The card sees virtually no competitive play, of course, given how common combo win cons are in CEDH, but at casual tables it can be a very powerful piece of persistent protection, especially when considering how infrequently players tend to run land destruction. Even if it isn't strictly a stacks piece, nor a viable competitive card, with how much it can screw over the average casual commander deck, it's a fairly understandable inclusion for the list. Grim Monolith is the next card we have, and this one is, again, a fast mana piece, albeit one that doesn't untap normally. Even so, though, you can get more mana out of it than you spend immediately, and any external untap effects will only drastically increase the mana advantage this card gives you. Combine that with the fact that it produces infinite mana with a myriad of other cards thanks to the untap effect, and this CEDH staple hits multiple points for being a pretty obvious game changer. Lion's Eye Diamond is in much the same boat, providing tremendous mana advantage and comboing with multiple other cards for infinite mana, coming down even faster and providing you with colored mana at that. Given it's even more of a staple than Grim Monolith is, it's another fairly easy inclusion here, and continuing with the theme of fast mana competitive staples, we're rounding it out with Mana Vault, another rock that gives you more mana than what you spent immediately. It doesn't combo quite as easily as Grim Monolith does, but given it's half the cost, that's rarely a concern. Outside of Ancient Tomb and the Moxes, Mana Vault is the most played card from the entire list so far, being another unilateral CEDH staple and thus another very easy game changer inclusion. That theme only falters slightly with our next card, that being Mishra's Workshop. Another new inclusion. This card is another fast mana powerhouse, but it actually doesn't see very much play, which is weird on its face. The reason is a bit twofold, the first being that the limited use for the mana, being only able to cast artifact spells with it, almost always makes it a less efficient version of Ancient Tomb, even if it produces more mana overall. The second reason is that the card is insanely expensive, being a rare from the Antiquities set that has only ever been very rarely given out as a tournament or event reward since, even most competitive players aren't willing to drop $2,500 on what amounts to a relatively minor land upgrade for most CEDH decks. That being said, I'm glad that the CFP picked up on it anyways, since I personally don't think the price should be a factor when considering bannings, or I suppose nowadays game changer listings rather. Still a card that I feel deserves a place on here, even if it's quite rare to ever actually see it. That leads us up to our final recent unbanning with Panoptic Mirror. This is a fairly interesting card, as it used to be quite a powerful combo piece with essentially any extra turn spell, allowing for infinite extra turns if you manage to resolve and activate it just once. That being said, extra turns have fallen off fairly hard in terms of competitive strength, seeing fairly low play across the board, and thus even with this as a combo piece, the low generic value of such cards might give many CEDH players pause before trying to run Panoptic Mirror combos again. That being said, it is possible that nowadays there are some more use cases for it, which could push it back into the competitive meta, and even then having this combo line might revitalize extra turns a little bit in competitive play. Time will tell, but I don't think it's going to be quite as meta impactful as something like Gifts Ungiven is, for instance. Otherwise, for the sake of lower bracket play, I have to imagine that most combos with this card will fall under the early 2-card combo limitation, and thus it won't really be a big concern as a game changer, but again, we'll have to see if anyone comes up with ways to break that rule. If so, I can see Panoptic Mirror staying on this list for a while, at least until experimentation with it is settled a bit and we can see just how strong it is in the modern day. And speaking of modern, the next game changer we have is the One Ring. Banned for being far too much of an easily includable powerhouse in the modern format, utterly dominating that meta for a while, this card still sees nearly just as much play in competitive EDH. Not only is it a generically powerful colorless draw engine, making it almost an auto-include in decks outside of blue that want to keep up with Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study, but it essentially has a worse Teferi's protection stapled on the ETB, the only downside being that it doesn't protect your board. Not that it needs the protection for itself though, when it already has Indestructible. So this card is powerful. It's a generic value engine, it's very difficult to remove, and it makes it significantly harder to lose the game for the entire turn cycle that it comes down up until your next turn. All this to say, an incredibly good CEDH staple that definitely deserves a place here. And finally, getting to the last card on the entire list, we have the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale. And unfortunately, compared to the cards just before it, this one is a little underwhelming. It's another utility land, which doesn't produce mana, instead placing an upkeep tax of 1 mana on every creature, forcibly sacrificing them if the cost isn't paid. This card can be pretty devastating to wide creature strategies, especially ones that don't spend the early game ramping up, but as we know, lacking mana with wide boards isn't exactly something that tends to ever come up in competitive play, and Tabernacle is another card that sees virtually no CEDH play as a result. However, it can be a pretty powerful hose for token decks or wide creature decks in casual play, especially since the effect is on a land. Generally speaking, a cheap Wrath will be more efficient and immediately impactful, but given this is a persistent effect as long as nobody is running land destruction, it feels kinda similar to Glacial Chasm, where it can be quite powerful at low brackets, especially when people tend to be playing with wider boards down there. So while it's another case of a card that isn't really CEDH viable, I'm pretty okay with it being on here for the sake of lower bracket play, as it can be a fairly difficult stacks piece to answer. And that's all for every card that's currently on the Game Changers list. There is technically something we missed though, or rather 2 somethings. With the most recent bracket update, there are 2 cards that were actually removed from the Game Changers list, so why don't we take a quick look at them? The first of the 2 is Trinisphere, which is a cute little stacks piece that makes it so every spell costs at least 3 mana. It's a pretty unique effect since it functionally sets the minimum cost of the spell after applying all reduction and additional costs, meaning that no matter what, you always pay at least 3 mana for anything you cast. While it's a pretty powerful stacks piece in CEDH, seeing a good amount of play there to help counter rituals, cost reduction, storm strategies, and just the general low average mana value of the format, it gets weaker in lower bracket play due to non-competitive decks trending towards higher average mana values. That being said, it's certainly not unplayable at low brackets, and I'd say it's generally quite good against most bracket 2 and 3 decks that I tend to see. So it was honestly a pretty reasonable inclusion for the list, but it did surprisingly get taken off with the recent update, presumably because it is more toned down in casual metas, and thus some people didn't think it was that big of a deal, I suppose. Still though, I feel like it had a pretty reasonable place on the list, more so than a good deal of the other cards currently on here. Secondly, we have Trouble in Pairs. It's another card draw value engine that scales with opponent actions, as well as having extra turn prevention. It's an enchantment, which makes it a bit more resilient, though it does trade a measure of synergy and ease of access as a result. Since it's an engine that benefits more from the 4-player nature of Commander, which is usually one of the defining factors for powerful engines in this format, that on top of the added stacks effect is probably most of the reason it was put on in the first place. And on top of that, it still does see a solid amount of CEDH play. Nowhere near a staple, of course, but still very playable. It is arguably the kind of card that scales more to the table, and thus you're not going to get as much value from this in casual as you would in competitive, but it's still a strong enough card with enough of a stacks-adjacent value engine slant to it that I'm also a bit surprised to see it come off the list, even if it's not nearly as strong as something like Rhystic Study, of course. In the context of the original list, I was a bit more mid on both of these cards being listed, but especially with the new update adding a bunch of what I would consider relatively weak or unassuming cards, I can't help but feel like taking these two off might have been a mistake. Though, who knows? There are still plenty of cards much stronger than these two that have dodged the Game Changers list after all, so time will tell. We've thus far been going over the list from both a mix of my personal experience with cards and somewhat recent CEDH play rates for said cards, but I did occasionally bring up EDH Rec Salt scores. A big focus of the Game Changer list is gameplay experience, and Salt is one of the easiest ways to ruin that. So I put together this graphic showcasing both the ordering of each card and the Salt score for each. If you're not aware, EDH Rec Salt scores are broadly a way to measure how unpleasant a card feels to play against based on community input, and the recent polling was somewhere around 1 million users, so it's a pretty decent sample size to see what people think. That being said, it is also entirely a vibes-based rating system. Some of the cards on here, such as the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, see virtually no play, so there's a good chance that most of the people voting on these cards have never actually played into it, and are just imagining how it would feel to play against it, which makes the ratings a little bit more nebulous. That being said, it's not a terrible way to pull the general feelings on cards, and looking at the scores, we can also pretty clearly see that the Game Changers list took a good deal of influence from EDH Rec. Vorinclex, Tergrid, and Jin-Gitaxias are right at the top here, despite being very unassuming cards competitively speaking. You've got Expropriate pretty high up here, which is, again, a card I thought was weird since it already inherently breaks the chaining extra turns rule. So it seems like even if a card isn't necessarily a problem for the bracket system in actuality, if enough people hate it, then it might get put on the Game Changer list anyways, as presumably more of a symbolic measure than anything. Similarly, I can understand certain stacks pieces being concerning due to the lower opportunities for interaction that they can provide, like Humility, but I think catching cards like Aura Shards just because they have a high Salt score here might be a bit misguided, given it, again, doesn't really fall into the category of being either particularly powerful or a stacks piece that can lock down the game in the right circumstance. Going even further, if we're assuming that cards end up on the Game Changer list due to an intersection of competitive strength, general stacksiness, and EDH Rec Salt score, then cards like Natural Order, which have a particularly low salt score, start to make even less sense, given they fit into none of the above categories. So, with all that in mind, I put together a little tier list for the current game changers on cards that I think deserve their place, and ones that I'd want to see unlisted, as well as any in-betweens. And while that's up in the background, I did want to talk about tutors, since I think I said I was going to explain my thoughts on those. So, tutors, despite seeing some of the most competitive play of any card archetype, actually have a really low average salt score. So generally the community perception on them must be pretty positive, and I kinda get why that is. The reason tutors are extremely powerful, even if they may not feel like it, is twofold. First, of course, is combos. Being able to cheaply pull combos out of your deck will always be a powerful and threatening effect, especially in competitive metas. In fact, I think last I checked, the average CEDH deck ran something along the lines of 11 tutors, and that's excluding like fetches and land ramp stuff. But what if you're not comboing? Well, it's true that tutors become less efficient when they aren't winning you the game right away, but even without that, they still provide a big consistency boost to any given deck. Even in a toolbox deck, any given tutor is always going to serve as a functional copy of the best given card in your deck for whatever the situation you happen to be in is. You'll always be able to get your best value engine or removal piece or finisher, with some slight variance depending on limitations of the tutor itself. But that level of consistency automatically makes it at least as good as whatever the strongest card it can tutor for is. And usually it makes it even better because you have the flexibility on top of that potential power. So long as you know what you're doing, the consistency boost of having tons of tutors in your deck, especially in a format as otherwise random as Commander is a tremendous advantage over opponents that don't run tutors, in my opinion. And that advantage gets more pronounced when there's a big power imbalance between your strongest and weakest cards. If you have a Cyclonic Rift in your Crocodile tribal deck that you can always just tutor for to eliminate opponent boards after a game of otherwise very slow, mediocre creature value buildup, then that's a pretty big shift in gameplay experience, which is exactly what the bracket system is built for. The main thing is that, especially with black tutors, the information is hidden, so as an opponent, you don't actually see it putting in the work directly. Or in the case of bounded tutors, people tend to blame the card that you searched for, but that card wouldn't be a factor in the game to begin with, without it being tutored for in the first place. So I'm personally very on board with tutors being listed as game changers, so long as they're actually good tutors, of course. If we see Mastermind's Acquisition end up on here for some reason, I am gonna start questioning a lot of things. I've already been yapping for a lot longer than I thought I would be, so I'll probably leave things here. But let me know what you think about the newest Game Changers list in the comments, since I'm really curious about other people's opinions on this stuff. It's all fairly new territory, and I would love to hear if you also think that some of these cards deserve to get unlisted, or if you think there are more cards that could get unbanned and added to the Game Changers list, for instance. Furthermore, I do want to hear about any cards that you think the Commander format panel might have missed on their first two sweeps here. Cards that should be put on the Game Changers list that aren't currently there, since I've been putting a little bit of thought into that myself. There's always the chance that people from the Commander format panel might end up seeing this stuff after all, so I think it's really good to have lots of discussions about the systems and cards involved. I think overall my thoughts on the most recent changes are a bit mixed. I did like some of the new additions, but others didn't make a ton of sense to me. I do think the unbannings are pretty cool, and it'll be nice to see those cards settle back into the format. It seems like the next updates for the system will be announced around late June to early July, so we'll have a bit more time for the current changes to settle before seeing what new stuff ends up happening. While I do think that the Commander format is exceptionally big when considering the card pool, I simultaneously don't want them to go too overboard with the Game Changer listings, since I think if we start to get too many cards here, people will start being less inclined to use the lists, and thus the bracket system as a whole. Some players, myself sometimes included, can hardly remember some of the cards they put into their own decks half the time, so having to keep in mind multiple lists with, say, multiple hundreds of cards total would probably be a bit much. And that's most of where my negative reaction to the recent GC list changes comes from, in that while I don't actually have strong feelings about most of the individual cards, I do think that adding too many cards uncritically isn't a good thing. And as I've said earlier, I think most of the new additions aren't actual power outliers, nor are they necessarily that annoying to play into. Plus there's the issue of cards that, again, are already arguably covered by the external bracket rules. But the bracket system is, of course, in a fairly early stage of development, so we'll have to see how things go. I do still think it's a good baseline, and I want to see it succeed. And while I could go on for a while longer, I really should end things soon. If you're still with me, thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. This video ended up a lot longer than I expected it would. I didn't even get to cover everything I wanted to, but it is what it is. If you liked what you saw, please do subscribe. I'll be talking about more Magic in the future for sure. And consider leaving a like and sharing this with any Commander players you know. I'm probably going to have to talk about stacks in general in another video soon, since that's like a big focus for the Game Changers list here, and I think there's a general kind of unwarranted hate towards stacks that might be a result of some decks overusing stacks. I actually generally like stacks cards, but I kinda think they need to be used in small doses, and I think people would probably hate them a lot less if it wasn't an entire deck of similar effects whenever they do end up seeing them. I'll also probably be making a follow-up video about cards that I think deserve to be added to the Game Changer list, since I think it would make for some interesting discussion as well. So again, do let me know what cards you think should make the Game Changer list that aren't already on there. I'm really curious to hear thoughts from the community on that one. And before I go, I did want to point out this funny little thing I noticed with the Game Changers list. So like, look at this, right? On the original graphic here, you can tell that most of the cards are alphabetically organized, but there are a couple that are actually out of place. So I almost wonder whether the lists or the graphic were like almost finalized and sorted alphabetically, but then they decided to add in these other cards afterwards. And if that's the case, then it's kind of crazy that they only tacked on ad nauseam at the end, or stuff like Lion's Eye Diamond or Mox Diamond or Mana Vault. Like, what I'm thinking might not be the case, but it would make sense, right? Otherwise, why would they be out of order like this? Mystical Tutor is kind of tacked on at the end of blue, and they did just recently with the new update add a bunch of other cheap tutors, so they probably didn't have that one on the original list until late in the process either, right? And Core Augur and Grand Arbiter Augustin getting added at the end might have been like a last minute look at the EDA Trek Salt list. Maybe it's just a silly coincidence though. Anyways, I'm rambling again. I gotta head out. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully you have a lovely day, and I'll see you next time.